Tabled. David Clinton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We heard earlier this afternoon in question time about some improvements in the delivery of drug and alcohol treatment to inmates in our prisons. And that's a good thing, and I suspect it will be not sufficient, but it is a step forward, and I acknowledge that this Minister of Corrections has made some genuine efforts to improve the situation around imprisonment and incarceration. Too little, but there are at least some good ideas, some good initiatives being seen. Sadly, in the overall picture, however, we have a very long way to go. And I believe some New Zealanders would be disappointed and surprised and even ashamed at some of the events and some of the conditions that are observable in some of our prisons. We have had two recent documents from watchdogs, independent bodies with no political axe to grind, that are very clearly and very graphically outlining some of the appalling conditions that people are being subject to in our prisons, something which is way below the mark for a country that prides itself on respect for human rights, for the rule of law. A report from the Human Rights Commission in December, monitoring places of detention, talks about the dreadful conditions in at least two of our prisons to which segregated prisoners are being subjected. It talks about particularly bad living conditions at Auckland and Mount Eden prisons for segregated inmates. It refers to accommodation for prisoners currently undergoing periods of segregation, and I quote, as being well below standard and could be considered cruel and inhuman for the purpose of the Convention Against Torture. And I believe that would shock and disappoint many New Zealanders, that we are subjecting inmates in our prisons to conditions that could be considered cruel and inhuman against the Convention Against Torture. It's simply not good enough, and it's something which we need to pay some real attention to. There were general shortcomings found in the whole matter of segregation in that document, in that report. We are told that part of the solution is in a rebuild of the maximum security wing at Palermo Prison, but that will not begin until sometime later this year. And I ask the question, when there is such a patent need for decent, humane accommodation for these inmates, why has that work at Palermo not been advanced ahead of the $900 million white elephant currently being constructed at Wiri? So the second document, the second report just from a few weeks ago, a special investigation into the management of a prisoner by the name of Arthur Taylor at Auckland Prison. And again, this finds that Mr Taylor initially put into segregation for a period of 14 days for the possession of a cell phone, which is, yes, it's something he ought not to have done. That 14-day segregation was extended to 8 months. For 8 months, this man was subjected effectively to 23-hour-a-day lockdown. He was deprived of the association, the company of other inmates. He was deprived of basic minimum requirements which ought to be provided to every inmate, and those findings come from our own Ombudsman's office, who I would argue are beyond dispute in terms of their observation. For 8 months, the Corrections Department failed to follow its own rules. There was a complete breakdown in the checks and balances. Decisions were made in advance of information being presented. There were process failures, which have been noted by the Ombudsman. There were failures to address, even to provide minimum requirements. There was for many days and indeed weeks at a time, this inmate had no access to exercise in the outside. Mr Speaker, this situation needs a response. It is no light matter. I have signed a letter along with others, including a QC and barristers, asking the Commissioner of Police to consider whether criminal charges ought to be brought against the management of Palermo Prison and indeed against the Chief Executive of Corrections for their failure in their duty of care to inmates. They are legislatively obliged to ensure that the inmates in our prisons are treated decently and humanely. According to the evidence of the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Commission, they failed in that duty of care in ways that could well be put them in contravention of our Crimes of Torture Act, and we have asked the police to investigate that. So we need to do a great deal better in our prisons. It's not good enough, and we look to a better time with a more progressive government. Kia ora.
Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr. Speaker, 50 years ago in 1963, in a small town in Te Aroha in the North Island, one David Richard Cunliffe was being born. Sitting on one side of the bed was the good fairy,